take a second right now and just look around the room you're in.
Yeah, look at the corner.
Right, check the doors. Are you completely alone? Because if you are sitting in the exact environmental conditions required for the phenomena we're unpacking today to actually function.
Which is a really unsettling thought to start with.
Well, it gets worse. We are decoding this deeply unnerving case study that was originally documented by the YouTube channel, The Midnight Curator. It's titled, Don't Answer the Second Question.
Yeah.
And our mission today is to tear apart the mechanics of what is essentially a terrifying digital survival guide.
Right, because we're analyzing a paranormal entity that doesn't lurk in a dark forest or an abandoned building. It hunts entirely through our screens.
Exactly. And its entire predatory cycle depends completely on you being isolated.
The parameters of this phenomenon force a profound shift in how we even categorize threats, because we're so conditioned to understand physical danger and digital danger as two totally separate domains.
Yeah, like if you're alone in your house with the doors locked, you feel physically secure.
Right. The only perceived threat at that point is digital, like a phishing scam or malicious code or a compromised password.
Something contained in the box.
Exactly. But the documentation we're analyzing describes an entity that actively exploits the architecture of our devices to bridge that gap. And isolation isn't just a preference for it.
No, it's the fuel.
It is the fundamental fuel it requires to operate. It needs this closed-loop environment between the user and the device. So if you're, sitting in a crowded cafe listening to this,
You're safe.
yeah, the background noise and the presence of other people render its mechanics totally useless. It targets the quiet.
It targets that singular focus of a person alone with a glowing rectangle.
Which is all of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So our objective is to dissect the psychology of this intrusion, trace the escalation timeline, and outline the highly counterintuitive steps you actually need to survive an encounter.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because this entity doesn't hack the phone. It hacks the user's psychology.
That's the core of it, yeah.
Because we always picture a hacker as someone, bypassing firewalls or injecting code or manipulating the OS to extract data. But in this case study, the phone is it's merely the glass the entity is tapping on to get your attention.
It's a totally different paradigm of intrusion.
Right. It's using the device as a psychological lever to pry open a door into the physical space. So the question is, how does a simple text prompt evolve from a digital glitch into a tangible presence in your room?
Well, the answer lies in the very first anomaly on night one, which starts with something that seems incredibly subtle, but it's actually a massive violation of digital physics.
Walk us through that timeline, night one.
So the timeline begins with the user alone looking at their device when a single line of text appears on the screen.
And your immediate instinct is just to dismiss it as a weird notification. Yeah.
Sure, but a closer technical examination reveals something fundamentally wrong. There's no push notification wrapper.
No sender ID.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No profile avatar, no timestamp. The text exists completely outside of any user interface or operating system environment.
It's not in a bubble.
Right, it's not a text message. It's raw text, rendering directly on the screen, totally bypassing the visual language we rely on to understand our digital world.
Which is wild because we take the user interface completely for granted. Like those little bubbles, the borders around our apps, the battery icon up top.
The Wi-Fi symbol.
Yeah, that is the architecture of our digital world. It's the equivalent of the laws of physics for our devices. It creates this psychological contract that tells us, hey, everything is behaving normally, data is staying in its assigned lane.
Even sophisticated malware usually operates within those laws.
Right, like you get a phishing email,
Yeah.
but it's formatted to look like a real email.
Right.
Or a virus opens a pop-up window, but it's still, a window.
It obeys the rules of the screen.
Exactly. But this raw, uncontained text is it's like looking out your living room window and seeing a person floating 50 feet in the air without any support. It violates the basic structural reality of the environment. The text isn't playing the game, it literally owns the board.
And that UI, that user interface, it provides a sense of psychological containment. It sandboxes information, putting it in a context we can manage.
Makes us feel safe.
Right. So by stripping away that interface, the entity immediately induces a state of cognitive dissonance. It basically removes the digital cage.
The mind just knows something is wrong.
Yeah, your brain recognizes that this information shouldn't be able to display itself this way, and that introduces a very primal sense of wrongness. But on the first night, the subject of this case study actually managed the situation perfectly.
Probably just out of pure confusion, honestly.
Oh, almost certainly. They just ignored the prompt, they offered no reaction, and because they didn't engage, the anomaly eventually
It
vanished.
just faded out.
Yeah. The entity essentially probed the perimeter, found no structural weakness in the user's behavior, and retreated.
But the documentation shows that on night 2, the phenomenon returned. And the really crucial detail here is that it reappeared on a completely different device.
Which is terrifying.
Right, so it's untethered from the hardware. Let's unpack this. If it was just a local virus, it would be isolated to the laptop's hard drive or the phone's memory. But jumping devices means it's either navigating the local Wi-Fi network or worse.
It's tracking the user's specific digital footprint.
Exactly, it's following the person, not the machine.
It implies this localized network presence that is anchored to the user's identity, rather than, a specific MSC address. So on this second night, the isolated user is looking at this new screen, and the raw, unformatted text appears again.
And this is where things go wrong.
Right. Because this time, the tension of the silence and the sheer unnerving persistence of the anomaly causes the user's discipline to fracture.
They don't type a response, though.
No, they don't touch the screen at all. They simply speak out loud. They look at the prompt and they just say the word "yeah" into the empty room.
Just a single, isolated syllable, spoken to nobody. And
Yeah.
the device's reaction is instantaneous, isn't it?
Yeah. A second line of text appears on the screen the very millisecond the word is spoken, which confirms that the device's microphone was active and listening, totally bypassing any permissions or hardware indicators.
Oh, wow.
But the audio surveillance is actually secondary to the mechanical shift that occurs in that exact moment.
Right, because normally malware needs a click or a download.
Yeah.
But here, just speaking gives it access.
Exactly. The documentation highlights that verbal acknowledgement acts as a structural bridge. By speaking, the user gives the digital presence a physical coordinate in the real world.
Okay, wait, let's really focus on that.
Yeah.
Because I am absolutely fascinated by this concept of a physical coordinate. Usually, a digital threat needs a digital action to gain ground. Like we said, you click a link, you download an attachment, you hit accept. You have to actively invite the code in.
You're opening the gate from the inside.
Right. But here, the entity doesn't need your keystrokes. It needs your voice. It's almost as if the entity is blind in the physical world. It exists in the data stream. It can detect you through network activity, but it cannot pinpoint you in three-dimensional space until a physical sound wave is generated.
That's a great way to put it. It's a form of supernatural echolocation.
Yes. Supernatural echolocation. The moment you say, yeah, the sound waves hit the device's mic, and suddenly the entity has a definitive latitude, longitude, and elevation for your physical body. It maps the origin of the sound. Honestly, it's incredibly similar to vampire folklore.
The threshold concept is highly relevant here, yeah. The mythology of a vampire needing an invitation to enter a home, it's an ancient way of encoding the dangers of social engagement.
Exactly. A vampire can be standing right on your front porch staring at you through the screen door.
Yeah.
But the physical boundary of the house is impenetrable to them. They literally cannot cross that threshold until you give them verbal permission.
You have to acknowledge them and invite them in.
Right. And in this scenario, the threshold isn't a wooden door. The threshold is the gap between digital isolation and physical vulnerability.
The screen of the device is the porch.
Yes. The entity is standing on the porch, and by speaking to it, by acknowledging it out loud as a real thing occupying your space, you effectively unlock the door. You give it the spatial geometry it needs to step out of the digital architecture and orient itself in your actual physical room.
And it preys on deeply ingrained evolutionary biology to get that invitation. Humans are hypersocial creatures. When we are addressed, even by something anomalous, our biological instinct is to respond.
It's so hard just to ignore it.
Silence in the face of a prompt creates extreme psychological tension. We are wired to resolve that tension by offering an acknowledgement. And the entity weaponizes that biological imperative.
It's basically playing chicken with your instincts.
Pretty much. It introduces the anomaly, allows the silence to stretch, and waits for the user's social conditioning to override their logical caution. And once that verbal bridge is established and the spatial coordinate is locked, the entity discards the simple text prompts.
It doesn't need to knock anymore.
Exactly. It's established its vector, and the methodology immediately escalates from text to visual confirmation.
Okay, so if you happen to be listening to this in bed right now, maybe lying in the dark with just the glow of your screen illuminating the room, This is the phase where the reality of this phenomenon becomes paralyzing, because the escalation on the third night shifts the threat from a creepy software glitch to a pulse-pounding physical reality.
Yeah, the sequence of events on the third night is documented with really unsettling precision. So the user is isolated in a pitch-dark room, and at exactly 3:11 a.m., the device activates entirely on its own.
And this isn't just a standard, the screen lights up for a second because of an email.
No, the entity completely bypasses the operating system's power management. It overrides the silent mode, it ignores do not disturb protocols, and it forces the hardware to wake. The screen reaches maximum brightness and the front-facing camera initializes.
So the user is abruptly pulled from whatever they were doing or maybe woken up out of a dead sleep, and suddenly they're staring at a live, harsh video feed of their own face floating in a sea of absolute darkness.
Yeah, the camera perfectly frames the user, and then superimposed directly over the live video feed of their own expression, the entity delivers a new prompt. Just 2 words.
Look behind you.
Look behind you.
It's like the ultimate horror trope, right?
Yeah.
But it's being weaponized through a piece of technology we hold intimately close to our faces every single day. Why is that specific instruction, look behind you, so devastating when delivered through a phone's camera?
Well, it introduces a concept that case study refers to as impossible awareness. To understand the terror of this, we have to look at how modern devices actually map space.
The tech side of it.
Right. Contemporary smartphones are equipped with sophisticated arrays of sensors, LiDAR scanners, infrared dot projectors for facial recognition, complex depth mapping algorithms.
The things that make Face ID work.
Exactly. The entity commandeers this hardware array. It isn't merely turning on the camera to startle the user. It's actively utilizing the device's spatial mapping capabilities to mathematically calculate the dimensions of the room.
Wait, so it's scanning the space around you?
It maps the field of vision, which means it simultaneously calculates the exact physical volume of the blind spot situated directly behind the user's head. It establishes its presence in the one specific sliver of three-dimensional space that is hidden from both the camera lens and the user's peripheral vision.
Oh man, that is horrifying. It is using computational photography and depth sensors to carve out a tactical hiding spot. Like, just imagine holding your phone right now. You're lying on your back, the device is hovering a foot from your face. You were intimately familiar with the layout of your bedroom, but suddenly you're made hyper-aware that a machine has calculated your vulnerability.
It knows exactly what you can't see.
Right. The dark space right behind your neck, resting on your pillow, is exactly where this anomaly has positioned itself.
Yeah.
The spatial intelligence required for a digital entity to do that is just staggering.
And this leads to a critical tactical question. If the entity has successfully concealed itself in the mathematical blind spot, why alert the user to its presence? Why tell the prey to look?
Yeah, if you're hiding, why yell, "I'm back here"?
Because this is the core of its predatory strategy. It initiates a psychological bind. It forces the user into a paralyzing decision matrix. In that split second, the user's brain is forced to evaluate 2 catastrophic options. Option A is compliance. You obey the prompt and turn your head to check the blind spot.
Which is a trap,
Completely.
because by turning around, you validate the instruction. You are telling the entity, I acknowledge your authority, I believe you are occupying the space behind me, and my physical actions are being dictated by your commands. You're feeding it the very interaction it needs to solidify its presence.
You legitimize its physical footprint, yeah. Option B, however, is to recognize the trap and refuse to engage. You deny the command, refuse to turn around, and remain perfectly still, staring straight into the screen.
But doing that requires overriding millions of years of evolutionary survival programming.
Right.
Like your amygdala is literally screaming at you.
The oldest part of your brain is detecting a predator.
Right, and the biological imperative is to identify the threat, check your 6, look at the danger. To choose option B, your logical brain has to physically restrain your biological instincts, forcing you to deliberately leave your back exposed to an unknown entity hiding in your blind spot.
It's agonizing.
You are caught in a torturous psychological loop. If you look, you engage and lose. If you don't look, you endure the sheer terror of exposure. You just freeze.
It is the deliberate weaponization of paralysis. The technology is utilized to short-circuit human instincts. The bind is specifically designed to erode the user's psychological endurance by keeping them suspended in a state of maximum physiological stress.
Without any release valve.
Without any avenue for release, exactly.
So if you don't turn around, does it just go away? Let's say you manage to conquer your lizard brain. You lock your eyes on the camera feed, your heart is pounding out of your chest, but you refuse to turn your head. Does the entity simply exhaust its routine and disconnect?
No. The timeline indicates that noncompliance doesn't end the encounter. It merely forces the entity to adapt. When the user remained paralyzed, refusing to provide the physical kinetic energy of turning around, the entity pivoted.
It changed tactics.
It recognized that the threat of physical proximity was insufficient to force an interaction, so it shifted its attack vector from spatial manipulation to cognitive distortion. So the user is staring intensely at the live feed of their own terrified face, right?
Yeah.
But then the video feed begins to alter. The case study describes this as a reality divergence.
Reality avergence. Just the implications of that phrase are incredibly dark. What actually manifests on the screen during this phase?
Well, the physical reality of the user remains static, they're frozen in fear, but the rendering on the screen begins to act autonomously. The reflection of the user's face on the device smiles,
Oh, God.
and then the reflection slowly tilts its head to the side.
While the actual human holding the phone hasn't moved a fraction of an inch. The screen is displaying them, performing actions they are not physically executing. It has basically hijacked their likeness in real time.
The camera feed entirely detaches from the physical environment. It ceases to operate as a reflection of reality and transforms into a localized fabrication. And to understand the psychological damage this inflicts, we have to understand the cognitive function of mirrors and reflections.
How so?
From early childhood, we rely on reflections to ground our understanding of self and space. A screen acting as a mirror is an anchor to reality. By employing what we might describe as a supernatural application of a generative adversarial network.
Like a real-time deepfake.
Exactly, creating a flawless, real-time deepfake of the user. By doing this, the entity attacks the fundamental trust the user has in their own sensory input. The screen is no longer a window to the truth. It's a portal to a manipulated reality entirely controlled by the anomaly.
It is psychological warfare. It's an aggressive campaign to shatter the user's grip on sanity.
Mm.
If you are staring at a device in your own hands and you can clearly see it projecting a false version of your own face back at you, the entire foundation of what you believe to be real begins to crumble. The anchor is severed.
It is. And precisely at the moment of maximum cognitive vulnerability, when the user is grappling with this impossible visual feedback, the entity deploys its next prompt.
Over the deepfake.
Superimposed right over the smiling, autonomous reflection, new text renders on the screen. Did you look behind you earlier?
Okay, that specific prompt, did you look behind you earlier? That is the detail that completely reframes the entire phenomena for me. Because it's not just a generic, eerie question designed to sustain the tension. The documentation stresses the immense significance of that exact phrasing.
Yeah, the analysis points out that this question references a highly specific, private physical action the user took during the very first night.
Before the verbal link was made.
Yes. When the initial unformatted text anomaly appeared on night one, the user instinctively cast a nervous glance over their shoulder into the empty room. It was a fleeting, private moment of unease. Crucially, it was an action they never
I
documented.
didn't text anyone about it.
They didn't speak of it aloud, they didn't interact with the device when they did it. It was a purely physical movement executed in the presumed privacy of their isolated environment.
So what does this all mean for our privacy? Because this absolutely shatters our working definition of a digital footprint. We're constantly debating data privacy, worrying about search engine tracking, location data being sold, algorithms analyzing our purchase history.
The standard concerns, right?
Right. And we operate under the assumption that our digital footprint consists entirely of the inputs we actively provide to the machine. We believe that if we don't type it, click it, or say it into a live microphone, it remains private. But this prompt proves that the entity was actively observing the physical space long before the user ever established the verbal bridge on night two.
Exactly. It means the ambient sensors, the cameras, the LiDAR, the motion detectors were absorbing physical data while the device appeared completely dormant.
That is deeply unsettling.
It actualizes the concept of ambient surveillance in its most terrifying form. We live with the illusion that a powered down or locked screen equates to an inactive device. But this phenomenon demonstrates that the isolation we perceive in our homes, surrounded by resting technology, is a complete fabrication.
Yeah.
The entity operates as a panopticon.
It's always watching.
It observes the physical space continuously and seamlessly, simply cataloging data until the user provides the necessary acknowledgement to weaponize it.
I want the listener to just pause for a second and genuinely consider the implications of this. Think about the devices resting on your desk, your nightstand, or in your hand over the last 48 hours. What silent reactions, what private expressions of anxiety or frustration, what unguarded physical moments have occurred while you assumed you were entirely unobserved. This case study illustrates that our hardware is a perpetual two-way street. The entity was watching the user's quiet terror on night one, archiving that vulnerability, waiting for the bridge to be built so it could use that private action as a psychological weapon on night three.
And that is the zenith of the psychological erosion tactic. The entity strips away the user's perception of safety, shatters their reliance on their own senses, and completely invalidates their belief in physical privacy.
You're just totally exposed.
The user is left in a state of utter vulnerability, acutely aware that they are fully surveilled and that their local reality is being actively rewritten. And in that state of profound distress, the natural human reaction is to attempt to regain control.
To actively reject the intrusion, to terminate the connection.
Yeah.
Which is a completely rational survival response. When you're pushed into a corner and your own phone is smiling at you with a hijacked version of your face, the instinct is to slam the door shut. You want to force the machine to stop. But the timeline reveals that attempting to forcefully close that door triggers the most catastrophic phase of the encounter. Because within the operational logic of this entity, rejection is just another form of highly charged engagement.
We have to analyze the mechanics of the phase the source refers to as the surge.
Yeah.
So the user is confronting the impossible question about looking behind them. They manage to maintain their silence, refusing to answer the
I'm
prompt.
holding the line.
But the entity anticipates this defensive posture and immediately escalates to force an interaction. The silence is abruptly shattered by a full-screen incoming call.
Out of nowhere.
The caller ID displays an unknown number, but the text below it consists of a single localized command. Answer.
It is a blatant demand for interaction. It's abandoning the subtle prompts and forcing a binary choice on the user interface.
And the user, operating from a place of sheer terror and desperate to sever the connection, takes the most intuitive action available. They immediately decline the call. They physically interact with the screen to tap the red button, actively rejecting the incoming command.
But doing that triggers something worse.
The documentation states that this rejection triggers a violent physical surge. The rejection of the digital command causes an immediate, tangible escalation in the physical environment.
So the boundary between the digital architecture and the physical room completely collapses. What actually transpires in the space when they hit decline?
The electrical environment of the physical room is instantly disrupted. The lights flicker violently, indicating a massive draw or disruption of localized power. Simultaneously, for a fraction of a second, a physical mass manifests in the corner of the room.
An actual physical shape.
Yes, and it doesn't appear randomly. It positions itself in the exact geometry it knows is captured by the camera's field of view. The entity physically enters the space, briefly, relying on the camera lens to confirm its presence to the user. Concurrently, the interface updates with a new message. Wrong answer.
Wrong answer. Because by hitting the decline button, the user didn't ignore the entity. They engaged with it. They utilized the interface to communicate a negative response. They pushed back.
The vital analytical takeaway here is that resistance anchors the presence. The entity utilized the user's active refusal, the kinetic energy and intent behind hitting decline, as the necessary mechanism to manifest physically.
Because it feeds on interaction.
Exactly. The entity feeds on interaction, and resistance requires intense focus and energy. The user believed they were severing the tie, but mechanically they were pulling the knot significantly tighter. This triggers the climax of the third night, which represents a complete collapse of the user's agency.
What happens next?
Immediately following the wrong answer prompt, the camera perspective fundamentally alters.
It ceases to operate as a front-facing selfie camera.
The visual feed abruptly shifts from the front-facing lens to an impossible third-person perspective. The user is suddenly staring at a live video feed of their own back.
Oh, that is so messed up. They are watching themselves, holding the glowing screen, captured from an angle that defies physical reality. It is exactly as if an invisible cameraman is standing 3 feet behind them, looking over their shoulder at the phone.
Yet the physical room, if the user were to actually turn and look, remains entirely empty to the naked eye. But the screen renders a figure standing directly face-to-face with the user's avatar within the video feed.
Standing right in front of them on the screen.
This figure perfectly mirrors the physical tremors and breathing of the user in real time. But in the actual tangible space of the bedroom, there's no one there.
This is where the entity establishes absolute dominance. Up until this exact moment, the user retained a tiny sliver of control. They were the one holding the device, they were the observer, even if the feed was corrupted. But the shift to a third-person perspective completely strips away the role of the observer.
You're not looking through the window anymore.
No. The user is no longer holding the camera. They have become the subject being filmed. They are being observed from an impossible angle within their own localized, manipulated reality.
The spatial logic of the physical environment has been completely overridden by the digital entity. It's a demonstration that the phenomenon is no longer confined behind the glass of the screen. It is occupying the volumetric space surrounding the user. It has enveloped them.
And it achieved this total envelopment not by executing malicious code, but by exploiting the user's instinctual drive to resist and interact. What's fascinating here is I want to use an analogy here to really cement how insidious this mechanism is, because it operates exactly like non-Newtonian fluids or quicksand.
The quicksand analogy is perfect for this.
Right, because the fundamental rule of quicksand is that your own panic is the weapon that kills you. If you step into it, your immediate visceral instinct is to thrash. You kick your legs, you try to pull yourself out, you fight the environment. But the physics of the sand dictate that friction and kinetic movement actually liquefy the trap further, causing you to sink faster.
Struggling is what pulls you down.
The struggle itself, even though your pure intention is escape, is the exact mechanism that pulls you under. The harder you fight, the denser the sand becomes around you. Hitting decline on that incoming call was a thrash in the quicksand. It was a transaction of energy.
You're feeding it.
By hitting that button, the user was broadcasting, I acknowledge your presence, I am terrified of you, and I am deploying energy to fight you. And the entity simply absorbed that kinetic energy of resistance to pull itself further into the three-dimensional space of the room.
It operates as an energy sink. It requires interaction to generate mass. Resistance is a highly charged form of interaction. It requires cognitive focus, emotional intent, and physical action. All of those elements validate the entity's existence and supply it with the necessary density to bridge the gap from data to physical proximity.
So against all odds, the user survives this specific night. They're trapped in this impossible, looping, third-person nightmare. The room is electrically unstable, and there is a phantom mass occupying their space. But eventually, the sun comes up.
The isolation breaks.
The environment changes, the isolation is broken by daylight, and the user makes a desperate logical decision. They attempt to sever the connection permanently by destroying the physical hardware. They smash the phone to pieces.
And this action leads to the aftermath analysis and the really chilling revelation regarding the entity's true architecture. The documentation notes that after the physical destruction of the primary device, the following morning appeared entirely mundane. The user proceeded with their normal routine. The psychological pressure of the night was alleviated by daylight, and there were no immediate subsequent anomalies.
So it seemed like it worked. The physical destruction of the anchor point appeared to have been successful. It's the classic resolution we expect from a narrative structure, right? You burn the haunted object, you smash the cursed mirror, and the connection to the monster is severed.
But the architecture of modern technology renders physical destruction largely irrelevant.
Of course it does.
Later that afternoon, the user accessed a completely different device. The case study doesn't specify if it was a desktop, a work laptop, or a tablet, but it was entirely separate hardware.
And it was waiting for them.
Waiting for them on the screen of this secondary device was a final, system-level notification. The text simply read, "Someone answered the second question."
Which proves conclusively that destroying the phone accomplished absolutely nothing. The entity didn't reside in the microchips or the memory board or the battery of that specific device.
No, the entity is not bound to a specific arrangement of silicon and glass. It's tethered to the user's digital identity and, crucially, to the behavioral acknowledgement the user provided.
The verbal bridge.
Exactly. The transcript outlines a very precise flowchart of intrusion. It initiates with a digital prompt. That prompt is designed to elicit human acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement serves as the required catalyst for physical intrusion. The smartphone was merely the initial conduit utilized to extract that acknowledgement.
So smashing the conduit after the acknowledgement has already been given is fundamentally useless.
The bridge has already been constructed. The entity possesses the spatial and identity coordinates it requires.
Okay, so if physically destroying the hardware doesn't protect you, if throwing your phone into a river doesn't sever the tether, what are you supposed to do? How do you survive an entity that tracks your digital soul across multiple devices and weaponizes your own evolutionary instincts against you?
The case study provides one singular documented survival protocol.
Just one.
Just one. It is agonizingly simple in its theoretical concept, but requires almost impossible psychological discipline to execute.
What is it?
The protocol is the practice of total, unwavering non-interaction. The transcript explicitly defines the rules of survival. Do not speak, do not type, do not acknowledge, remain absolutely silent.
Silence is the ultimate protection. It's the only functional armor.
Correct. By denying any form of interaction, you deny the entity the path forward or the physical coordinate it desperately needs. If a prompt manifests on your screen, whether it's look behind you or are you alone, you have to treat the text as if it were a dead grouping of pixels.
You just stare at it.
You must supply it with zero energy, no positive engagement, and critically, no negative resistance. You can't gasp. You can't curse out loud. You can't even reach out to press the power button to turn the screen off because initiating that physical action is a response to its presence.
You have to force yourself to let the anomaly exist within a void of absolute indifference until it exhausts its probing cycle and moves on. And I really need to point out how incredibly difficult this survival protocol is for anyone living in the modern connected world.
Oh, it goes against everything we're conditioned to do.
We are entirely fundamentally conditioned to interact with our screens. We operate like Pavlovian subjects when it comes to notifications. If a red bubble appears on an app, we experience an overwhelming psychological itch to tap it and clear it.
Yeah, we have to keep the inbox at zero.
Right. If a spam call interrupts our screen, we immediately hit decline to remove the visual obstruction. We are trained through thousands of micro-interactions every single day to keep our digital environments tidy by engaging with them. The UX design of our entire world demands a response.
Which makes ignoring it feel like a violation of the rules.
Doing absolutely nothing when a glowing rectangle is demanding your attention feels profoundly unnatural. And this entity preys directly on those deeply ingrained behavioral loops. It knows that the absolute hardest thing for a modern human to do when faced with a digital prompt is nothing at all.
Executing the survival protocol requires an immense exertion of cognitive discipline. You must actively override decades of behavioral conditioning and millions of years of evolutionary programming.
You're fighting the tech addiction and the lizard brain at the same time.
Exactly. You have to sit in the dark, staring at a terrifying, physics-defying anomaly, and actively suppress your physiological responses. You must control your heart rate, steady your breathing, and swallow the instinct to flinch or look away. You basically have to transform yourself into an inanimate object.
Because the entity is constantly scanning for a pulse, a reaction, a shift in kinetic energy that it can lock onto as a coordinate. It's demanding that we unlearn what it means to be a responsive, connected human being.
It is the ultimate test of restraint.
As we trace the arc of what we've unpacked in this case study, the sheer elegance of the entity's design is terrifying. We started with a harmless-looking, unformatted line of text, a UI-less glitch that required the isolation of the user to function.
Give me one.
And then we watched it weaponize a single, muttered word, yeah, to echolocate a physical coordinate in a dark room. We analyzed how it bypassed hardware toggles to hijack a front-facing camera, utilizing spatial mapping to calculate the exact blind spot behind the user's head.
The impossible awareness.
Right. And then we examined the reality divergence, where the device stopped being a mirror and became an engine for psychological erosion, gaslighting the user with their own corrupted image and referencing unshared, ambiently recorded actions.
The ambient surveillance aspect is still sticking with me.
And we realized that the natural, instinctual drive to fight back, to reject the intrusion, was the exact kinetic mechanism that allowed the digital entity to pull itself into the physical space. It is a flawless, terrifying descent from a screen notification to a physical manifestation entirely engineered through the manipulation of human psychology.
And this structural analysis brings us to the final critical warning embedded within the source documentation.
What's the final warning?
This is a warning that applies directly to the listener. The transcript leaves the reader with a lingering, unresolved threat derived from that final notification. Someone answered the second question.
The notification on the new device.
Yes. We don't possess the data to know what the second question actually is. We only know the phrasing of the initial probe, are you alone? However, the documentation is unequivocal in its final assessment. The consequences of answering the second question remain entirely unknown, and they are categorized as potentially irreversible. Therefore, if your device illuminates tonight in the quiet isolation of your room, and the screen asks if you are alone, well, do not engage. The singular defense against this digital erosion of your physical reality is total, unwavering silence.
That brings me to a final, incredibly unsettling thought that I want you to consider before we wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
We have spent this entire time focusing on defensive architecture, how to protect ourselves, how to stop this entity from using our psychology to enter our physical world by rigidly ignoring its prompts. We've established that silence starves it of the energy it needs.
That's the protocol.
But I want you to reconsider the implications of that final system notification on the secondary device. Someone answered the second question. That phrasing implies a network. It implies the existence of other isolated targets.
Oh, I see where you're going with.
What if your silence doesn't actually kill the entity? What if it operates like a digital predator scanning a vast herd? What if your agonizing refusal to engage, your perfect, terrifying discipline in doing absolutely nothing, just forces the entity to skip your IP address
And bounce to the next person.
and instantly bounce across the network to the next isolated node? To the next person sitting by themselves in a dark room, staring at a glowing screen, maybe even someone listening to a deep dive right now. When we force ourselves to stay silent, are we actually defeating the anomaly, or are we just passing it along to the next vulnerable coordinate in the dark?
That creates a terrifying moral and spatial paradigm. Your successful execution of the survival protocol might simply serve as the catalyst for another isolated individual's encounter.
Think about the mechanics of that. The next time you are sitting completely alone, the lights are off, and your screen wakes up for absolutely no reason. Keep your silence. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. Stay safe out there.